Saul had sent some people to try to do just that. They had failed, and so Saul himself finally went, thinking, well, he'll be able to get David and bring him back and see to his execution. And of course, Saul himself was overcome by God's Spirit and fell on the ground and was engaged in this kind of prophetic, ecstatic moment that lasted for some time. Jonathan, his son, took that as good news. He believed that this was finally the moment in which Saul was going to return to his senses, and so he was believing the best of his father. David, on the other hand, a little more cynical, was not as persuaded. And so the two men, Jonathan and David, meeting later, obviously don't have quite the same view of Saul. Jonathan wants to think better things. David, still very cautious, but the one thing they can agree on is their determination to do the best thing for one another in spite of their disagreement about what's happening with Saul. And so they cook up a little plan. The intention of the plan is to smoke out what are Saul's real intentions toward David. Has he had a change of heart or not? And that plan is now being worked out in its details, and that's where we pick up the story this morning. So we're about halfway through chapter 20. That's where we left off last week. We're going to pick up at verse 18. We'll finish chapter 20. We'll do all of 21 this morning as well. And so that will be a pretty good sized bite, but I think we can get through it. So picking up at 1 Samuel chapter 20, beginning at verse 18, the Word of God. Jonathan said to David, "Tomorrow's the new moon. You'll be missed, because your place will be empty. On the day after tomorrow, you shall go a long way down, go to the place where you hid yourself earlier, and remain there beside the stone. I will shoot 3 arrows to the side of it, as if I shot at a mark. Then I'll send the boy," probably Jonathan's own son, saying, "Go find the arrows. If I say to the boy, 'Look, the arrows are on this side of you,' collect them. Then you are to come, for as the Lord lives, it's safe for you. There is no danger. But if I say to the young man, 'Oh, the arrows are beyond you,' then go, for the Lord has sent you away. As for the matter about which you and I have spoken, the Lord is witness between you and me forever." Famous little incident involving a bit of archery, and it becomes the basis upon which this communication would take place. So anyway, let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Our Father, we're grateful for this remarkable life. We thank you for both the great moments of heroic display, but also those moments of some failure. We thank you that David was, among other things, a human being, that he was prepared to acknowledge his frailty, and we pray that we might gain an example for ourselves through the review of his story. Bless our time together, we pray this morning, in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, well, we have this story then that picks up as Jonathan and David are working out a plan connected to a festival that took place once a month, associated with the new moon and with the closest Sabbath. And it was customary, apparently, for the king to have kind of a special recognition of that, which would involve his immediate court. And so that's going to be the occasion in which this particular effort to find out Saul's true intentions will be discovered. It's going to take place over a 3-day period. The Hebrew that is translated quickly or a great distance, a little obscure, but it at least tends to suggest that David was going to have to go into some kind of hiding situation that might require him to travel a little bit to do so. The Hebrew actually mentions a stone marker that was out there, apparently well known, goes by the name of Etzel. I think it said Ritzville, 60 miles on it. It was right out there outside of town, but everybody knew where it was, and apparently that was the location in which these two would then have an opportunity to communicate with each other once they discovered Saul's inner thoughts. So we have the plan. I'll shoot 3 arrows. If the arrows land on this side of the boy, then the motioning by Jonathan, come on back, coast is clear, you're safe. But of course, if the arrows go beyond, then the motioning signal to David would be, you better get going. Things are not as we had hoped. And in fact, he says, it's the Lord who's sending you away. This, of course, represents one of those fundamental themes we find throughout the Scripture, that though this is the action of Saul, and though we cannot in itself endorse Saul's behavior, yet at the same time, Jonathan steps back and understands that this is also God's work. Joseph once said, what you intended for harm, God intended for good. Jonathan might say, what Saul intends for harm, God intends for good. It's the Lord that's sending you away. We always need to bear that in mind, that though God may work in mysterious ways and sometimes works through unlikely agents who don't have the best intentions in mind at all, nevertheless, God is never thwarted, but actually accomplishes his purposes thereby. And certainly, Jonathan seems to recognize that here. Jonathan reminds David of the conversation that they've had. It began with David seeking Jonathan's protection, reminding Jonathan of their covenant, insisting that Jonathan not double-cross him. Tell me what the actual outcome is going to be. But interestingly, by the end of the conversation, things have reversed. And it's Jonathan who's seeking David's protection, because it seems maybe in some moment Jonathan has recognized David will in fact be the next king, that this is clearly where God is going. And Jonathan is concerned now, because if David behaves like most ancient Near Eastern monarchs, he would wipe out the preceding dynasty and all the family and anybody else that might make some kind of claim to the throne. And Jonathan would, of course, be caught in the crossfire of that. And so, interestingly, both of them are obliging the other one to their own well-being. Jonathan seeking David's protection once David becomes the king. David seeking more immediate care from Jonathan in the immediate situation. So, here we go. David hid in the field, and when the new moon had come, the king sat down to eat the feast. Now the king sat on his seat, as at other times, on a seat by the wall. Jonathan arose, and Abner and sat by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul didn't say anything that day, because he thought, something's happened to him. He's unclean, probably that's it. He's ceremonially unclean. So it's kind of an informal setting. It became much more formal in later generations of the kings of Israel, but now it seems to be a somewhat less stuffy environment. They are sitting around a table, Jonathan apparently on one side, Abner on the other. The inner court, the main men, you might say, of Saul's court are present there, but David is absent. Jonathan apparently sitting right beside his father, in a position of prominence there, but David is absent. Saul doesn't want to tip his hand. He doesn't want to disclose too early what's going on, what his intentions are. He has destructive designs for David, but he kind of plays it cozy, acts as if nothing's wrong, doesn't say a word, assumes that David isn't there because of some practical impediment, like he'd come in contact with a dead animal and he was ceremonially unclean, that sort of thing. So, first day passes, we still don't know the outcome of this little experiment. The second day of the month, David's place was again empty. Saul said to Jonathan, "Hey, where's the son of Jesse? How come he hasn't come to eat, either yesterday or today?" So Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem. He said, "Please let me go, for our family is having a sacrifice in the city. My brother has commanded me to be there. So if I found favor in your eyes, please let me get away and see my brothers." Therefore, he hasn't come to the king's table. So there's the cover story. It's the second day. It's a 3-day observance, but we're only halfway through it at this point. Interesting detail, kind of a footnote. Jonathan indicates that this festival had been organized by the brother of David. Normally it would be the father, the patriarch, who would organize such a thing. It has suggested to some that maybe by now Jesse is dead, or at least ill, and can't participate. That may become a factor as the story unfolds, but at this point we'll just leave it as a little loose end there that is not quite certain what it means. There's a little bit of almost light humor in the way that Jonathan responds to Saul. The little phrase, David wants to get away, is actually to escape, but it's representing a kind of light-hearted response to this. No big deal. Jonathan is just trying to put his dad in. David just needed to get away for a day or two. I'm sure it's not any problem. Kind of just being rather dismissive about it and hoping and expecting that Saul will join in that particular attitude and that nothing will come of it. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a beep." Oh, sorry, I almost slipped there. The Hebrew politely renders this somewhat other than the normal English idiom that you're all aware of. "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Don't I know you've chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, you will not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore, send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." So I don't need to tell you the expression that would commonly be used in this setting, and the counterpart to it is exactly what Saul said to his son. Some have read this a little bit too woodenly and actually thought that Saul was raising a question about the parentage of Jonathan. That's not what's going on here. There was no wayward mother, and this is not anything implying that. This is just a burst of rage coming out of Saul toward his son. This phrase about his mother's nakedness is a kind of Hebrew idiom. We would say it meant something like this, that the mother of Jonathan would be ashamed to have given birth to such a son. You're such an embarrassment, you see. So that's kind of the flavor of the whole thing. The phrase here, "he shall die," literally is, he's a son of death, which again is a Hebrew idiom suggesting that's his destiny, that's what his life is heading for, that's the only thing that can happen to him. And at this point, Saul just wants to expedite the process, and Jonathan is obviously standing in the way. Saul, as we know, is primarily motivated by his own envy of the great esteem and popularity that David has increasingly enjoyed here in Israel. That's what prompted this whole thing in the first place. Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Saul probably assumes that that same kind of self-centered concern resides in Jonathan's heart somewhere. And Saul just wants to reach it. Don't you understand, Jonathan? As long as that guy is alive, your own claim to the throne is very much in jeopardy, as if Jonathan is going to respond to an appeal to Jonathan's own selfishness, you see. Saul is looking for a like attitude in his son. Unfortunately for Saul, it's not there. And Jonathan's loyalties are in a vastly different direction, so that particular attempt misses the mark. And in fact, this whole argument that should have persuaded Jonathan that he was putting in jeopardy his claim to the throne misses the mark, because Jonathan is already recognized. He's not going to be the next king, and I think you might say in some deep sense he doesn't want to be. He sees in David such vastly superior qualities that he himself is going to be happy to step back and let this man, who has obviously been tapped by God for the job, to do the job. And of course, Jonathan, at this point, we hear later, hopes he'll be standing at David's side. It'd be a rather remarkable thing, but that's what Jonathan envisions. Didn't happen that way, of course, but that's what Jonathan's thinking. Well, Jonathan is clearly upset in the extreme by this response. He answered Saul, his father, and said to him, "Why should he be killed? What has he done?" Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger, ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. Again, the phrase cast a spear here may be a little too strong in translation. It certainly suggests threatening to cast it, brandishing it, holding it up. Jonathan was probably sitting right beside his dad. It wouldn't be easy to cast a spear at that point, but it certainly would be possible that he grabbed a spear in a kind of threatening manner. I think that's probably the intended sense of what we find there. Jonathan himself rises in fierce anger. His anger is not largely or primarily based on the insult to Jonathan. That may have played into it to some degree, but we have every reason to think that the real motivation behind this anger is Jonathan's concern and grief over David. David has been wrongfully accused. He's been accused of things of which he has no guilt whatsoever. And anger provoked by false accusations is a legitimate anger. There is something in the scriptures known as a kind of righteous indignation. And at this point, what Jonathan is experiencing and expressing seems to fall much more in that class than simply the personal affront that he's just been insulted by his dad and called bad names. This is much more profound than that, I think, at least it appears to be the case. It does represent a critical moment of what was very likely a breach between father and son. And I imagine that that breach lasted for the rest of their lives together. Jonathan actually probably contemplated, at least to some degree, the prospect of going off with David, going and joining him, joining the other team. I think that it probably at least crossed Jonathan's mind, but he didn't do that. He stood with his father, even though he disagreed profoundly with his father over this matter. But he continued to serve in his court. I imagine there was always a strain in their relationship, but eventually Jonathan would die with his father on Mount Gilboa. And the lament written by David at that point, of course, celebrates the lives of both of them. Jonathan had been his best friend, Saul, his worst enemy, and yet David joins them together in the lament that we'll look at eventually. This breach between father and son, one commentator indicated, is not uncommon when the son departs from the father's designs. A wise father will find a way to work past the friction to a deeper level, possibly sacrificing paternal agenda for paternal relationship. Many of us in this room are fathers. Some of us have had experience with a son who decides to go a different direction. Some of us have been sons who have had to deal with a father who was not happy because of a direction the son decided to go. Most of us can imagine that situation. A wise father, as this comment points out, sees past it, recognizes that sometimes what I had in mind is not what God had in mind. And there's a kind of maturity that says, I'm going to prioritize the relationship over my game plan. It's not easy to do sometimes, and sometimes fathers make a huge investment in their plans for their sons. In this case, of course, we have an interesting case of a father who doesn't quite finally get it. Jonathan knew that he would not succeed his father, this person continues, but had the maturity to recognize in David the qualities that were superior to his own and to pledge his loyalty to David even at his own expense. Well, so it was in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed with David, and a little lad was with him. This again, presumably, is Jonathan's son. Then he said to the lad, "Run now, find the arrows that I shoot." And the lad ran, and he shot an arrow beyond him. When the lad had come to the place where the arrow was, which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan cried out after the lad, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" Probably motioning. David sees that, of course. Jonathan cried out after the lad, "Hurry up, don't delay." So Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came back to his master. So this was the prearranged plan, communication based on a prearranged signal. Now, to keep the boy distracted, Jonathan tells him to hurry up, get the arrows, at the same time communicating to David the outcome of the incident that had earlier occurred. The lad didn't know anything. Only Jonathan and David knew of the matter. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to his lad and said to him, "Go, carry them to the city." As soon as the lad had gone, David arose from the place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, bowed down 3 times. And they kissed one another, and they wept together. But David more so. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, 'May the Lord be between you and me, and your descendants and my descendants forever.'" So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city back to his father. He gets rid of the boy, gives him the weapon, sends him on his way. They were originally not going to meet. This was going to just be a secret communication. David would head off, into the Sherwood Forest, and Jonathan would head home. But I think their affection for one another overruled that original plan, and so instead, they do meet one more time, David coming from this marker, the stone of Itzel. The note here that David had much more intense emotion is interesting. I know you're all aware in our Western tradition we've tended to celebrate stoic males who never shed a tear, never show emotion. I think a little of that has waned in recent years, happily, but it's certainly been part of our heritage that a man's man is always, just stalwart and never shows the least bit of that kind of emotional weakness, as it's sometimes called. Well, David's not a good paradigm for that. But David is a good paradigm for masculinity, and I think all of us men should take note of the fact that David is a man who weeps, and he weeps deeply, and that is part of the image that he cuts for us in the Old Testament. And there's no question about his masculinity, his courage, his heroics, and yet at the same time the emotions that he expresses are something that is moving, I think, to anybody who considers his life the least bit seriously. This friendship between David and Jonathan is really a wonder of ancient literature. One commentator put it this way: the scenes in this chapter are some of the most affecting presented to us in history, whether in old or modern times. And we may well wonder at the delicacy of feeling and the gentleness of the sentiments that these two men in those old rough times entertained for one another. No ancient writer has set before us so noble an example of a heartfelt, unselfish, and thoroughly human state of feeling. And none has described friendship with such entire truth in all its relations, with such complete and profound knowledge of the human heart. It is true, if you read ancient literature, you can read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you can read Herodotus, you can read Roman histories, there's a lot of ancient histories. You will look in vain for anything that really approximates a friendship such as we find in the relationship between David and Jonathan. It is in a class by itself. And that in a sense, is one of the most remarkable things about the whole story of David, is you have this friendship highlighted so graphically and so powerfully. I'm afraid jaded sentiments of a modern age have wanted to read into this a sexual component which is absolutely not there. It is foreign to the text. There's nothing in the text whatsoever that would imply such a thing. Not only that, but it will also be flatly contradictory to the legal and ethical standards of the day, so that if there were such a component, that would clearly have been somehow acknowledged, and there'd be some recognition of it. The fact of the matter is, it is pure, unmitigated friendship. And that in itself, I think, makes it something that we should celebrate and recognize as a great paradigm that all of us should pursue. I remember when Dick Leon was here as a pastor, he left and retired or resigned from here. He went to Bellevue Presbyterian. After he retired, he came back to our church and held a seminar on how to age gracefully. I thought I was too young to go to such a thing. I wish I had paid more attention. But one thing I did notice at the time, when I listened to the tapes later, was how much he emphasized repeatedly in the presentations that he made the importance of friendship. He said there'd been statistical studies of this, and it showed that people who cultivated deep friendships through their lives, friendships that survived into their older years, did much better all the way around. They were healthier, they lived longer, they were happier, they had a more pleasant state of mind, generally speaking. Even if they fell into ill health, they still had a more joyful view of life than those who sort of entered into those years lonely, having pushed people away. Saul pushed people away, and he wound up dying, I think, it's very likely, a broken and very lonely man. This friendship was something that was good for them, for David and Jonathan. It's good for us. I say that because I'm not good at close friendships, and so I'm really just talking to myself here, but it's a good reminder, I think, for all of us to bear that in mind, and this is a great example of it. All right, next chapter, 21, is sometimes called in outlines of this whole section, civil war between David and Saul. I don't really like that, but I'm going to use it because it's commonly used. The reason civil war doesn't quite fit is because it implies that there is competition for the throne between two competing parties. David never at this point was competing for the throne. He wasn't in some kind of campaign to get the throne. Far from it. And so even though I'm using the term, I'm using that caveat to sort of disclaim that I mean civil war, at least in the ordinary sense of the term. But it's commonly used, and so that is what I'll use as well. Now David came to Nob, to Ahemelec, the priest, and Ahemelec was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" Nob is a little bit north of Jerusalem. Jerusalem does not yet belong to Israel. It's Jebus. It was under the Jebusites at the time, but it is in the neighborhood. The road that went to Nob was a bit of a fork in the road. It could either have gone back to Ramah, where Samuel was, or if you took a left turn, it could head off to Gath. I don't know which one David had in mind at the time, but we do know that the tabernacle at that moment was at Nob. That's where Samuel had instructed Saul to set it up, and that's where the Ark of the Covenant was housed, and the priest who was responsible to oversee the facility was a man by the name of Ahemelec. Ahemelec is concerned because he sees David coming alone and maybe a bit disheveled, and he's not quite sure what to make of it. Ahemelec is the son of the high priest at the time named Ahitub. Ahemelec is the great-grandson of Eli. You may recall Eli was the priest at the tabernacle when Samuel was a little boy. The first prophetic announcement that came to Samuel when he was still a little boy was against the house of Eli. And Eli was, of course, the tutor and the teacher of Samuel at the time. But as it turns out, Eli had done such a miserable job disciplining his own sons, who were also priests. They had so abused, so egregiously distorted the role of the priest, that God gave through Samuel a pronouncement of doom on the house of Eli. Eli accepted it manfully, you might say, saying the word of the Lord is good. But that condemnation had never been carried out. Now we're 3 or 4 generations later, and interestingly enough, it's at this point that in a sense the judgment pronounced against the house of Eli actually takes effect. It takes effect at the hands of Saul, and it takes, unwittingly of course, and it takes effect in some ways because of the intricate circumstances that play out right now. I just mention that now because we'll see that a little later in subsequent presentations, and we'll be able to refer back to it. At this point, Ahemelec sees David coming alone. There are apparently others who were with David, but they're either not visible or there was a prearranged rendezvous, so they're not there in the neighborhood. David probably assumed that Saul would look first for David in Bethlehem, his hometown, so he probably avoided going there. David had men serving under him. He probably grabbed a few of them, not too many, the most trusted ones, and we have a feeling then that David is traveling with some others, and he's trying to escape. Probably not quite sure at this point which way he's going to go, but anyway, that's the working plan. David, of course, at this point begins to cook up a story. The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, "Don't let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I've commanded you. And I've directed my young men to such and such a place." All right. Now we have to face a dilemma. This is not exactly what's going on, you know. David is making something up here, more or less out of whole cloth. There may be a little trace of truth in this, but it's mostly falsehood. As I was reading commentaries, and I've read several of them on this text, you find that they more or less split into two camps. And they both make a pretty good argument. I, of course, know the right answer. So I'm going to tell you who came up with the right answer in my opinion, but you can form your own judgment here because I think it is slightly dicey. Some, of course, say David just had a lapse of confidence. And now David is telling lies fast and free. He's making up these stories. He's making this whole thing up on the fly, and we should not see in this any kind of model of virtue, you know, and so they'll just kind of dismiss David at this point as he comes back to his senses eventually, but right now this is just a great collapse in his confidence in God's care of him. And so that's one hypothesis, and certainly I think we could at least entertain that idea. The other possibility, which I thought was certainly more sympathetic to David, and I think it has some horsepower behind it, is David here is faced with the dilemma of Ahemelec. He needs Ahimelec's help. He needs food. If there's a weapon available, he needs a weapon. He's escaping. He's a fugitive. He's a wanted man. Anybody that facilitates David's escape is going to become an accomplice in the crime and is very likely to face the same fate that Saul intends for David. And so now David is approaching a priest, and I think he just wants to give him, plausible deniability here. He wants to protect Ahemelec by giving a story to him that will pass muster from Saul's point of view, at least to the point that Ahemelec won't be a conscious participant, a conscious party in this criminal behavior, and yet at the same time will allow David to get what he wants. Now, you may or may not buy that, all right? I understand. Maybe I'm stretching the point too far, but there are some pretty good people that think David actually here was trying to do something that was in a sense protective of Ahemelec in the eventuality that somehow it came to light what had been going on in this. So you can take your pick between those two theories. Certainly there was some self-protectiveness on the part of David, but maybe it was also a little bit of protectiveness on the part of Ahemelec. Be that as it may, David now wants to solicit from Ahemelec whatever he can to help him on his way. What do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread of any kind, whatever can be found. The priest answered David and said, well, there's no common bread on hand. There's only the holy bread, the show bread as it's called, or the bread of consecration. If the young man have at least kept themselves from women. This is a rather obscure notion. It seems as if Ahemelec here is attempting to bend the rule as much as he can, the technical rule concerning what was supposed to happen to this bread, and at the same time accommodate David's request. So David is asking for whatever is handy. The only thing handy is bread that was only supposed to be eaten by the priests. You know the story, the showbread would go into the holy place of the tabernacle. It'd be there for some time. It'd be brought out. Nobody was supposed to eat it except the priests. Well, at this point, we're facing the question, should somebody besides the priests eat the bread? Well, Ahemelec seems to be willing to bend the rules if these men have at least participated in what was considered a fast, not from food, but from women, that is, even from their own wives, for the purpose of some kind of holy military venture. So that's kind of the rule that's being invoked at this point. It is bending the rules somewhat, but nevertheless, Ahemelec is willing to go there. This lengthy quote, because time is going to get away from me, I'm not going to read it, but the upshot of it is that in the Bible there is an ethic which puts priority on practical human need over ceremonial nicety. Ceremonial nicety is important, but practical human need can trump that need in particular circumstances, and so that seems to be what's going on here. And he cites to this example that comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus seems to apply the same rule. So we have in Mark's Gospel this incident where Jesus and his disciples were going through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. The Pharisees, professional nitpickers, said, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And here we have a ceremonial restriction that would seem to disqualify these guys from doing what they are in fact doing on the Sabbath. Jesus, referring to this very text, says, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar," who was the next high priest actually, "and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him." So here Jesus invokes this very circumstance to argue for the principle that substantial need overrules formal restriction. And when situations like that come up, that has been understood as the biblical ethic that's applicable. And then Jesus actually drops an even bigger bomb when he says the Sabbath was made for man's benefit, not vice versa. Man was not made for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. So Ahemelec, at this point, from Jesus' point of view, is on safe ground. And even though he's bending the rules, and in fact allowing this bread to be eaten by people who are not priests, nevertheless, it doesn't seem to be violating at any deep level the rule that would otherwise apply. So David answered the priest and said to him, and this is a very obscure text, and all I can do is the commentaries I read just scratch their head over this one, but I'll give you what I think is going on. "Truly the women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day." So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. 3 days, another kind of partial truth. Some say that David was just off his balance here, losing confidence. Others, of course, saying that he's trying to give good excuses to Ahemelec to do what David is asking. The business about the vessels of the young men being holy, the commentaries that I've read on it, all concur. This is a tough text. Making heads or tails of it is at best a little bit of a challenge, even for the best in the biz. But I think the consensus was that David is arguing to Ahemelec something along these lines. Although our journey is not connected with a religious object, yet the bread will be kept holy in the vessel in which it is carried, to wit, our bodies. So these men, at least as David is telling the story, have put themselves in a kind of fast situation, which makes them in some sense or other holy, which means that if they eat the holy bread, they're still okay ceremonially. That's a long way around the barn for my money, but if you've ever puzzled over that text, at least that seems to be the general consensus as to what's going on. One way or another, Ahemelec bought it, and so the bread that had been removed was given to David. It was by this time stale. Even the priests would rarely eat all of it. They'd eat some of it because the law required it, but at this point it's put to a better use, and that use is, of course, David and the fellows that are with him. It does appear that David's kind of working this story out on the fly and barely avoiding difficulties. I imagine that Ahemelec himself was kind of going, what's up with this? I'm not so sure, but Ahemelec doesn't press too hard, doesn't cross-examine too aggressively, and so the whole thing occurs something like that. Well, it may have worked, but for the fact that there was a fellow there named Doeg. A certain man of the servants of Saul was there, detained before the Lord. He was an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. Detained doesn't necessarily mean confined or incarcerated. It could be a variety of circumstances that had parked him there at the tabernacle for a few days, and we're not told what it was, but it may be benign. But it did give David apparently a bit of a sense of foreboding, which he alludes to later when the massacre of the priests took place at the hands of Saul. This man was a somewhat important official in Saul's staff. He was an Edomite, a foreigner, but he was also the chief of the herdsmen, and Saul's wealth in large measure came from livestock, and so Doeg had an important position to play. It could be that had Doeg not been there, this visit at Nob by David would never have been discovered, but of course we're going to learn later, maybe as early as next week, what came out of this particular incident. So David said to Ahimelec, "Is there not on hand a sword or a spear? For I brought neither my sword or weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." So the priest said, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There's no other except that one here." David said, "There's nothing like it. Give it to me." So maybe inspired by seeing Doeg there, maybe that was the thing that caused David to start thinking about weapons. We don't know. Nevertheless, he gets this sword that he had actually taken from Goliath in the incident involving those two. David, as you know, had kept the head of Goliath as a trophy of war, but he turned the sword over as what's called a votive offering, became kind of part of the museum that was associated with the tabernacle. Now he wants it back, another case in which a ceremonial nicety is being set aside for the sake of practical necessity. The ephod is mentioned at this point. Its function in Jewish life at the time is a bit of a mystery. Seems to be related to the function of what's called the Hebrew oracle. I'm going to save comment on it for a later time because it does play a role in David's own career later as well, so we'll focus on that. Right now we're just noticing in passing that there it is. The Philistines were the master metallurgists. How's that? That'll do. They had a monopoly on this industry, and so we can assume that the sword owned by Goliath was probably quite a trophy. So again, David makes off with it, and then surprisingly enough, he heads for Gath, the king of which was Achish. This is called out of the frying pan into the fire, you know. One commentator just said, desperate times call for desperate measures. You ever heard that expression before? It seemed to fit in this case. Well, it had not been that long since the great champion of Gath had been killed by David. Why exactly would he go to Gath? You know, it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? David may have hoped he wouldn't be recognized. Maybe he thought Achish would view David simply as a deserter, even a soldier of fortune, selling himself out to the highest bidder. Maybe he just hoped he'd stay under the radar and he can kind of sneak into town and nobody would notice, and that would be his hideout for a time. He knew he was safe from Saul, not so sure about the disposition of Achish, the king of Gath. Well, it didn't take long for the servants of Achish to say to the king, "Isn't this David, the king of the land?" Didn't they sing of him to one another in dances, saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands"? They call him the king of the land already. He's not the king, he's a fugitive. This is a little bit of unwanted praise from David's point of view. He just as soon not be regarded as the king of the land. This little ditty that had been sung by the women there in Jerusalem had, of course, become famous, and even in Gath it was well known. Well, David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Psalm 34, the first psalm I want to mention in connection with the career of David, was penned after these events. I'm going to give it to you as a reading assignment for this coming week. The psalm really does reflect the state of heart and mind of David in this time. We hear that he changed his taste, changed his behavior. He scratched on the gate. Actually, the Hebrew there says he scratched the tau, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which makes the sign of the cross. Many have read into that some kind of significance, and I'm not going to plow into that too deeply, but it is an interesting circumstance that was what was going on. We don't know the significance of it to David beyond the fact that there's this interesting coincidence that it makes the sign of the cross. He pretended madness. The sense of this is not just being a man who is out of his mind, but it's more the madness of what's called lunacy. A lunatic is someone that has been struck by luna, struck by the moon, is moonstruck. So a lunatic was someone who was sometimes viewed with a certain degree of awe, as if they had a kind of ecstatic connection to the gods, and thus what they're doing at this point is viewed as some sort of exercise in a kind of mystical experience of the transcendent. It seems that that is what David was pretending at this point. Not clear why exactly he did that, except it was just to avoid, of course, any more sinister interpretation of his behavior. It could be he got the idea by seeing Saul at Ramah, who had been similarly struck, in a sense, by lunacy, only in that case it was the Spirit of the Lord that had overcome Saul. Well, Achish, of course, seeing all of this, isn't too impressed. Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Do I have need of another madman that you brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Got enough of them around here, he says. Shall this fellow come into my house? And so Achish drove him away. Psalm 34. The commentator that I was most intrigued by made this comment. He said, Achish had no fear of madmen, but sometimes rulers should fear them. The ordinary folks will never challenge the status quo, but the zealous madman can at times change the course of history. There's a few examples. If we had time, we could remark on that. Psalm 34 is entitled, A Psalm of David when he pretended madness before Ahemelec, another name for Achish, who drove him away, and he departed. A couple of lines from that psalm. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him, and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him, and delivers them. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. And later in the same psalm, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. All right, quickly, Sunday school lesson. We have three people with whom David has prominent relationships in this part of the story. One is Jonathan, his closest friend, his confidant, the one he trusts. I'm calling this friendship and devotion. One is Achish, who at best is kind of an enemy, certainly not one that David could control or influence. I'm calling the qualities here humility and resignation, meaning that all David can do is just accept whatever he gets at the hands of Achish. And then somewhere in the middle we have Ahemelec, necessity and protection. Ahemelec is kind of on the fence at this point. He's not a trusted friend, he's not a confidant, he doesn't know the whole story. At the same time, he's not an enemy. He's kind of in the middle there, and so it calls for a bit of politic behavior on David's part to deal with that particular part of his set of relationships. As to Jonathan, David had given and received promises from his friend that would guide his actions for years to come, and that would clarify his values in complicated situations, and that would fuel his heart of worship in his moments of greatest blessing. This is the function of a friend. It's the function of those who are closest to us and share most deeply the values that we ourselves cherish, and that was the role that Jonathan played. Achish, way out at the other end of the spectrum. David knew that Achish held his fate in his hands, and in that place he had no recourse but to humbly cast himself on the mercy of God, trusting in God's protection, resigning himself to the whims of an unpredictable and powerful ruler. When it came to Achish, it was the exact opposite of Jonathan. In this case, all David could do was trust God, hope for the best, cast himself in some sense on the mercy of this guy, while at the same time feigning madness. The one in the middle is the most intriguing and complicated. David viewed Ahemelec as the source of God's providential provision, even when Ahemelec did not fully appreciate the role he played, and when David was required to keep him at arm's length for Ahimelec's own protection. There are a lot of people we run into in life, I hope I can say this the way I want to say it, with whom we don't have deep, abiding, intimate friendship. At the same time, they're acquaintances. We're not required to spill every detail of our lives to every acquaintance we meet, and I think most of us have an intuition. That's not very smart to do anyway, But everybody that we meet, we should be thinking of their best interest. I think that's what David had in mind. I want to believe that of him. I've told you that. I think that's what's going on, even though there are some pretty good people that differ on that point. I think David wanted to protect Ahimelec. He needed some help from him, but he didn't want to get the guy embroiled into a controversy that wasn't his. It's a good illustration for us that every person we meet, we should have in our heart a concern for that person's best interest. They may be someone we don't like very much. They may be someone that we don't share much in common with politically or personally or family-wise or whatever. But there is a sense in which every person we meet could be a little bit of an Ahimelec to us, Someone that we want to protect their interests, we want to be good to them, we want to think of their well-being. And in that sense, I think maybe David teaches us some things even along those lines. All right, next week, Psalm 34, be sure to read that. Read chapters 22 through 24. We'll be covering some of that by next week, and it'll give you a sense of where the story goes from here.